We're going to do Ruth Chapter 4 today. My name is Richard Lee, and I'm excited about this book of Ruth. It is a fascinating book. And one of the things that amazes me about this book is that it's about Jesus. And one might say, you know, if you're a new believer, or if you're not really a believer at all, you might think, well, why would you be amazed that this book of Ruth is about Jesus? Isn't the Bible about Jesus? Well, the answer to that question is yes, the Bible is about Jesus. But think of this. This is one of the things that amazes me. Think of yourself. And think of your birthday. Now, think about, what if someone were writing about you at a minimum of 400 years before you were born? I mean, just at a minimum of 400 years before you were born. You see, that's the difference between the Old and the New Testament. And Jesus said that this book was about him. He was talking about the Old Testament. And so when we look at this book, Jesus said the scriptures were about him. And he was talking about the Old Testament. So when we look at this book of Ruth, this book tells us about redemption. It tells us about the fact that Jesus was going to and was able to redeem those that are kin to him. Now, to begin this fourth chapter, I'm going to do what I've done in the first three chapters and in the introduction to this book. I'm going to begin by reading chapter 1. We're going to do chapter 4, but I'm going to begin by reading chapter 1, verses 14 to 17. And it reads, and I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And I'll tell you in a minute why they were weeping. If you haven't been with me, you can go and read the book of Ruth or watch some of the earlier videos, but they were weeping. And who are they? They lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, that's Naomi, the mother-in-law. She said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Now see, I wanted to emphasize her gods. See, Orpah had her gods. Everyone has their God. We'll read on a little bit and then I'll comment a little bit more. Verse 16, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for wherever you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. I mean, have you ever thought about there being different gods out there? But Ruth says, I'm going to make your God my God. In verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord, that's Yahweh, do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. You see, Ruth loved her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth loved her enough to say, they had enough of a relationship. Ruth loved her enough to say, I'm going to make your God my God. And you see, that's what we're in this generation. That's what we have to do. We have to make Christ our God. We have to make the Lord, Yahweh, our God. We have to make the Holy Spirit our God. If you don't do that, see, we're sons and daughters of Christ through adoption. And if you don't make Yahweh your God, then you're not in the family and you can't be redeemed. You can't be purchased. And according to the Bible, each and every one of us needs to be purchased. But now, I want to just ask the question, what role does the Bible play in your understanding of God? What role does it play? You may answer, hey, it plays no role. Well then, listen to this. Don't cut me off unless you're just really disinterested. But but if you do, if within your worldview you say that the Bible plays a role of your understanding of God, then definitely listen to this beautiful story of Ruth. And I mentioned the Holy Spirit and the Son. Would you even know without the Bible that God has a son and that we're his children? See, according to the Muslim religion, God has no sons and daughters. That's what they say in the Muslim religion. And Jesus definitely was not a son. You see, we have to, in this book of Ruth, tells us about the attributes of God. We have to know all of the attributes, those things that we know about God, for the most part, and understand, I'm going to emphasize, for the most part, we know them through the Bible. So we're not to make up our own gods. We're not to, and whoever your God is, if you're like Orpah, you're or don't be like Orpah, and go back and retain your God. Now, this book of Ruth, it starts out in the first chapter. That's Elimelech, that's Naomi's husband, and their children, Malion and Kilion. They're in the land of Bethlehem, where there's a famine in chapter 1. And because of the famine, Elimelech takes his family, his wife and his 2 sons, and they go to the land of Moab. And in the land of Moab, they had their own gods, which, like every nation, had its own gods, if you will. And so, because there was food, they were able. There was food in the land of Moab. Now, again, I mentioned in the earlier lessons, and I'll say again, God could have sustained that family in the land of, or in the city of Bethlehem, in the land of Israel. God could have done that, but they chose to go to Moab, and there's a lesson right in that, and as I've said earlier, I'm not saying that I wouldn't have or haven't done something similar to what they've done, what they did then. But then Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, and the 2 sons, Malion and Kilion, marry 2 Moabite women. That's Ruth and Orpah, and that's what brings us up to where I read out of chapter 1, verse 14. They accept or marry Moabite women. And I raised a question as to whether they should have done that in the first place. Then Malion and Kilion died. And now the 3 women are widows. and they're really in a strait, and they're determined. They're just trying to determine what they're going to do. So Naomi decides that she's going to go back to Bethlehem, and she's urging her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, to stay in Moab. But as we just read, Ruth says she's not going to do that. She's going. So when you get to chapter 2 of this great book, Ruth decides, she happens to, she decides she's going to go out and glean, which that's, go into the field to pick food so that she and Naomi could live. And she so happens to come upon the field of Boaz, who is going to wind up being, and we'll see that in this chapter 4, her kinsman redeemer. See, Boaz is a type of Christ. He fulfills the role pictorially, if you will. Now, no one, is a perfect Christ, but all throughout the Bible, we see types of Christ in the people that God uses to fulfill his purposes. So Ruth just happens to come upon the field of Boaz. And I want to emphasize happened because it was no coincidence. God is orchestrating history. God is taking care of these women. So Boaz, he finds out, he asks his servants about Ruth, and finds out that from his servants that she's a noble girl, and finds out all of the things that she has done for her mother-in-law Naomi. And he tells her, look, don't go to anyone else's field. Stay and glean in my field for protection. In chapter 3, Naomi tells Ruth to go to where Boaz is gleaning. And bottom line, she says to Ruth, my words, read chapter 3, it's talking about a covering. You do use the word covering, but that's the way of asking the man to marry you. So it's just a beautiful, beautiful picture. So now we pick up, or before we pick up in chapter 4, I'm going to read a verse out of the New Testament just to just really show that this isn't nothing new. And Peter talks about this in this book of Peter. This is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 to 19. And Peter writes, he says, if you, he's talking to those people, those Jews that were scattered, if you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's works, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth, knowing that you were not redeemed. That's that word, redeemed. You weren't purchased. You weren't bought back with perishable things like silver or gold from your feudal way of life, inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood. You see, you were bought. These people were purchased with the precious blood as of a lamb. Oh, how beautiful that lamb, that sacrifice. As of a lamb unblemished and spotless. The blood of Christ. You see, Peter is saying that this book of Ruth is about Christ also. Well, let's go ahead and get into chapter 4. Now Boaz went up to the gate. See, at the end of chapter 3, Boaz had said, he was going to do for Ruth whatever she asked. But there was a Goel, or a kinsman, that was actually closer in relation to Naomi than he was. So that person actually had first right of redemption. So now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. He's at the gate of the town there in Bethlehem. And behold, it so happens, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend. Sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. He, that's Boaz, took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the closest relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." And he said, this is this fellow, which is called friend, and I'll comment on that in a minute. And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz, verse 5, said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." Now let's go back and let's talk about these first 5 verses. In verse 1, this word close relative, which is goel in the Hebrew, and redeemer, and you're going to see this word redeem. I've talked about it in the introduction. It's used throughout this book of Ruth, and it's really used in this book. I think it's used a whole lot in verse 9, I think. So, but they're the same word. They're both goel. And they're the same Hebrew word. And in addition to that, goel can also be translated as avenger, as in the avenger of blood. You can look at verses such as Numbers 35:12 and Numbers 35:19. There are many places where that's used. Now, why? Throughout this lesson, I've been talking about how these words are translated. And I'm not saying that the New American Standard translators didn't do a good job in their translation, but what I want you to understand is that there's work, there's interpretation in taking words from one language, in this case Hebrew, to English, which you and I understand. There's work in doing that. Translating there's not a one-to-one correlation, so there's overlap in meanings of words. And so even when I say that, for example, that it can be translated avenger, I'm not saying that avenger is what it should have been translated here. Context matters. We have the same thing in English. I mean, there are many words in English. I think of the word run. If I were to say that there's a run on the banks, that has a different connotation than me running in a race to try to be the first one in the race. Now, I'm very slow. I've never won a race in my life unless I was running against a turtle. But you understand the point. And what I'm trying to urge you to do is, if you're able to, go back and look at these words. At least look across translations and see how the different translators translate things. You know, I was talking to a guy yesterday, and he was telling me, you should just use the King James translation. Well, believe me, they did not come out with the New King James Version just because of the these and thous that were used in the King James translation. There are some things that are very obvious. And I'm not saying that the King James translation is a bad translation. That's one of the translations that I'll look at. But there are some places, and this is what I'm trying to urge you to do, where if you look at King James or any other translation, this translation that I use also, where I think that the translators could have made a better choice in terms of how they translate it. So now in verse 2, you got 10 men at the gate. You know, the gate served as a place, well, back in verse 1, the gate was a place to conduct legal business, as well as social intercourse, and sometimes court was held there. I'm not going to read any of these verses, but and again, there are many other verses. You could look at Amos 5:10, as well as Amos 5:12, and Amos 5:15, as well as Proverbs 22:22. Those are places that you can look. So he chose 10 elders in verse 2 to serve as witnesses. We're going to see later on in this verse where they actually take off the shoe. But think about this, they didn't have paper and pencil back in the day. It wasn't as prevalent as it is now. So, if you're going to do anything legal today, you write out a contract, and you may get your lawyers involved, and both parties sign the contract, and that makes it legal. Well, you had to have human witnesses to attest to legal matters, and that was what Boaz was doing here in verse 2 as he took the 10 elders. And he told them to sit down because he wanted them to witness the transaction that he was going to, make, or what he was about to propose. Then we get to verse 3, and it says, "Then he said to the closest relative." That's Boaz, to the closest relative. "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to your brother Elimelech." Now that reminds me, I'm just want to make one more comment about verse 1, and again, that's about the word friend. Most commentators that I've looked at says that actually that word friend could have been translated so and so, and they commented on it in terms of different things. They believe that Boaz probably knew this person's name, but maybe the person that actually wrote the book of Ruth, which many scholars believe was Samuel, wrote it, that he may not have known the person's name. But this unnamed person that's named as friend in the New American Standard Version, and in some other versions, say, that most of them say, that it's a certain one, or it should be so and so. And I thought that was interesting. When you read the commentators, they give you an interesting perspective of that. So when we get to verse 3, and he's talking to this closest relative, this redeemer, this Goel, He tells her, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, have to sell a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. Now I want to, I know I've read out of Leviticus 25. I want to read a couple verses to emphasize this idea of the close relative in redemption. And that's Leviticus 25:25, which reads, just read the entire chapter of Leviticus 25 for context. But this verse, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor, you see, Naomi and Ruth had lost their husbands, and Naomi had lost their sons. So, they're in a strait. They needed men for economic protection as well as physical protection. So they had become poor. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor, he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. See, they were to keep it in the family. God said, if you go back and read, that ultimately, God was taking Israel into the promised land. He says he's going to give them this land that's flowing with milk and honey. But really, they were just sojourners in the land. The land was always God's and would always be God. And that's another whole story within itself. I'll read one more. That's from Jeremiah 32, verses 7 and 8. And that reads, Behold, Hanmiel, the son of Shallum, your uncle, is coming to you, saying, Buy for yourself my field, which is at Anathoth, for you have the right of redemption to buy it. Then Hanmiel, my uncle's son, came to me in the court of the guard, according to the word of the Lord, and he said to me, Buy my field, please, that is at Anathoth, which is in the land of Benjamin. For you have the right of possession, and the redemption is yours. Buy it for yourself. Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord. So again, read Jeremiah 32 for context. But that's just, again, to give you more of an idea of redemption. So Boaz speaking in verse 4, So I thought to inform you, saying, Buy it for yourself. See, now Boaz is saying to this one that's a closer kinsman than he is, a closer Goel than he is, buy it before those who are sitting here, those that are witnesses, and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. Again, that's word redeem, Goel. Same word as kinsman. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, this so-and-so, or friend, said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz, in verse 5, says, On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased in its inheritance. See, now acquire Ruth. See, there's a woman that comes with it, and this so-and-so, a friend, we're going to see that he doesn't want to do that. And again, I'm just going to read a couple more verses to indicate the point. Then Judah, this is Genesis 38:8. Then Judah said to Onan, Go in to your brother's wife and perform your duty as brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. See, that was what was supposed to happen. Again, read Genesis 38 for context. I'm going to read one in the New Testament, Matthew 22:24. These were the the religious people of the day, I forget whether it's, see, I need to go back and look. I believe it was the Sadducees. I'm about to say the Pharisees. No, the Sadducees asking or talking to Jesus, saying, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother as next of kin shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother." See, now they were testing Jesus in that. So that shows what God was making provision for for his people. Now let's read verses 6 through 10. In verses 6 through 10, this mouse over here, I tell you, it's hard for me to see it. The closest relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance." "Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption. I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Malion." Those are the two men that had died, Naomi's two sons that had died and married the Moabite women. In verse 10, "Moreover, I have acquired Ruth." See, I'm purchasing, and some people don't like that word, purchasing. I have acquired Ruth. He could say, I'm a redeeming Ruth. I have acquired Ruth the Moabites, the widow of Malion, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased, doing what God had told him to do. If you read over there where I read in Genesis, you see that God killed a man because he wouldn't do that. But again, you have to read that for context. "Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Malion, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are my witnesses." So now let's talk a little bit about these verses 6 to 10. Okay, verse 6. Boy, I tell you, this is hard for when you get old. It's hard to see. So this closest relative, verse 6, that's the one that's really called so and so. He will never be named in history. Oh, God is the God of history. As long as we read the Bible, we read this book of Ruth, and I talked about how it's just really unusual. Ruth is only one of two women, to have a book of the Bible named after her, and she was a Moabite. She was not even from Israel originally, but again, she became part of Israel by adoption. So this closest relative, this unnamed person, said, "I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." Now, some people believe that this man was already married, and he was concerned about, that if he had acquired Ruth and married her, first of all, he didn't know her, he definitely didn't love her, that he would have, in terms of his children and his possession and what he was going to pass down, he didn't want to spread that too thin. but you know, he was going to get the field that Elimelech and therefore Naomi owned. So, you know, I mean, that's a possibility. Some think, don't too many mention this, that even Boaz himself may have been married, or at least married at one time. Because we're going to see, or we have seen, that Boaz was much older than, if you look back in chapter 3, you see that Boaz was much older than Ruth. So now in verse 7, now it was the custom in former times of Israel concerning redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter that a man removed his sandal and gave it to another. And this was the manner of attestation in Israel. As I said, they did not have lawyers to sit down and write up contracts, and they pulled out their pencils and sign on the dotted line. You go back, I think I've read this before, but go back and read in Deuteronomy 25, 5-10. Now, you'll read over there that, you know, if the relative was really, really a close relative, there was a time, and he didn't want to perform the you know, that levirate right, and the role of the kinsman redeemer, and marry the widow and raise up children, that when they pulled off that sandal, they would spit in the person's, or the woman, I think, then, you know, go back and read, would spit in the man's face. And I'm smiling when I say that. You know, I mean, it's, I guess I wouldn't want anybody to spit in my face. But you know, sometimes customs, things that we look back at this book. You know, we look at these books that were written, you know, I said at a minimum, you know, of 100 years before, a minimum of 400 years before Christ was born. You know, I don't know the exact date. You know, again, I can go, and there are scholars that will look, and you know, they'll put a specific date on it. You know, I'm not that precise. I think, in the first lesson where it says, you know, this was at the time that the judges were judging. I read out of the book of Acts, and I think I read that it was over a 400-year period. And I'm, you know, my best guess would be that it would have been in the roughly in the middle to early part of that 400-year period from the book of Acts. Go back and check me out in the first lesson. So you see again that the man pulled off his sandal, and that was the manner of attestation. So verse 8, he's going ahead and confirming it. He's saying, Boaz, you know, so the closer relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and removed his sandal. Then verse 9, and then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses. Oh, that concept of witnesses. See, God says that don't do anything without 2 or more witnesses. It is really important. You know, they did not have DNA, and they did not have all of the technology that we had today. And so things were attested through witnesses. So Boaz is saying in verse 9, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Malion. And then in verse 10, moreover, I have acquired Ruth. See, Boaz loved Ruth, I believe. I believe that he did, and he respected all that Ruth did for Naomi. So he acquired, now again, that acquired, he's going to make her his wife. They're on an equal setting in that sense. Now you remember back in chapter 3, Ruth lay down at his feet and said to him, "Cover me." But now he's making her his wife. And I believe they had a beautiful marriage. I believe that they had a beautiful, loving marriage. So I've acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Malion, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. So now let's look at the next section. Next 5 verses, verses 11 to 15. Some people will break this out verses 1 to 12, and then I think like 13 down to 18. I'm just reading it in 5-verse chunks. When I do other books, I will break it out more in terms of topic. So verse 11 to 15. All the people who were in the court and the elder said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephratah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Now let's comment on this. In verse 11, Rachel and Leah is mentioned. Now, one commentator, I thought this was interesting. They were from the tribe of Judah, and Leah was actually the mother of Judah. You can go back and start reading in Genesis 29 and 25 and following. Again, read the entire chapter, read the entire book of Genesis for context, but definitely read chapter 29. It's where you see Rachel and Leah. Now, one thing that's interesting to me, and I kind of know, when you think of the 12 tribes of Israel, there are 2 other women that were concubine, the handmaids of Rachel and Leah, and that's Bilhah and Zilpah. I believe 6 of Judah's sons came from Bilhah and Zilpah. I said 6, it may have been 8. Well, I know Rachel had 2. Leah may have had, I think Leah had 6. So that's 8. So you got 4 more. So, okay, Bilhah and Zilpah, I think, had 2 each. Again, check me out on the number, but they aren't mentioned at all. I guess, again, you look at status. They were concubines of Jacob or Israel. Rachel and Leah were his wives, and it's an interesting story as to how Leah became his wife. You know, Leah was the oldest, but they had 12 sons that made up the nation of Israel. Then in verse 12, you see, moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So if you go back to Genesis 38, this time down in verse 29, and so you start reading about Judah and Tamar. You can also see in Genesis 46 at about verse 12 that you've got a genealogy of Perez, but you're going to see that genealogy mentioned over there in Matthew chapter 1. You're going to see that mentioned. You know, Perez was one of twins, and I think he was I believe he was the firstborn of the twins. But you'll see if you read the story that there was bottom line, Jacob was not doing what he was supposed to do. In that you know, he went and had a relationship with a prostitute, or what he thought was a prostitute. It wasn't actually a prostitute, and these twins were born. Go over there and read that for full context. Now in verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Now one of the things that was interesting to me, or that's interesting to me, is that when Ruth and Orpah were in the land of Moab, married to Malion and Kilion, they had no children by the young men. But God enabled her to conceive through Boaz, through this kinsman redeemer. And one of the things that's really just interesting, I'm just going to mention this briefly. I'm not going to definitely harp on this, but it makes me think about this abortion thing. You know, and talking about a woman has a right to choose. It is God. You know, you don't know what plans God has for the child that's growing inside of you. You know, again, I don't want to spend too much time on that. This book is about Christ, the kinsman redeemer, and Boaz is that type. Now the woman, verse 14 and 15, then the woman said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. God took care of you, as he said, you know, as he set up in the provisions of his law. And may his name become famous in Israel. Well, it has become famous. And ultimately, as we're going to see, it's going to lead to David. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer in your old age. You see, if she being Naomi, and she being Ruth also, if they had lived in the old age without sons, without men, they would have had no one to take care of them. Remember, and I've mentioned this before, but see, when you stop and think, oh, the Old Testament and the Bible is outdated, they did not have Social Security and pensions are going the way of the dinosaur today. And there are some countries that were even today, the government doesn't take care of you. You don't have social programs to take care of you. You must rely upon family and community and friends to take care of you. And so, in verses 14, it says you're not left without a redeemer. And so she had the child. And we're going to see his name in a minute. May his name become famous. We're going to see what they named him in a minute. But verse 15, may he also be a restorer of life and a sustainer in your old age. That's what we've been coming for. Your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. That's 7. That's a number of completeness. Perfect. 7 sons and has given birth. She's got somebody to look after her. She's going to look after this baby now, but as she can grow old in comfort. She doesn't have to be bitter anymore. Remember when we started into chapter 1, coming into chapter 2, these women were saying, is this Naomi? And Naomi saying, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Because she went into the land of Moab full, but she came back empty. That's what she said. But now it's like she's full again. She's full again. So let's read 16 to the end, verses 16 to the end, which is the genealogy. And it reads, then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. Naomi, I could just imagine the smile on Naomi's face as she's nursing this little baby. She's taking care of this little baby. And she's saying, she was saying to Ruth and Orpah, look, I can't give you husbands. And even if I decided to, if I had a child today, would you wait until he grow up to be, your husband? Well, God had the plan. That's what this book of Ruth is about. God had the plan. So Naomi is smiling and having fun as she's raising this baby boy. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. See that? Dave's that down. Now Obed means, that's a form of the word servant. A lot of times, many times, when you see a servant in the Old Testament, it will be a form of Obed, and we have a book in the Old Testament called Obadiah, that's servant of Yah. So they named him Obed. Now these are the generations of Pharez. To Pharez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David. And we know David was a man after God's own heart. David was a man after God's own heart. So this was the plan. God had told Abram, or even before Abram, back to the Garden of Eden, God says that he's going to redeem man back to himself. He said in Genesis 3 that that the serpent would bruise him on the heel, but he would bruise the serpent on the head. That's all part of God's plan to bring man back to himself. So that completes this book of Ruth. Next, I'm going to do a topical series, again dealing with the word God. We've used this word God. I use it every day in my life. So I'm going to come back and do a topical series around a biblical definition, if I can say the word definition, of the word God. So I hope to see you, and I hope you enjoyed this study in the book of Ruth. You take care now.